He had always been proud of the house he built with his own hands. Every corner, every wall, every little garden patch outside had his touch. It wasn't just a house to him. It was a place of peace, a place where he felt safe after long days of work. He had spent years saving for it, planning every detail, and he loved it more than anything. For years he had lived quietly, respecting his neighbors, keeping to himself, and enjoying the calm of his little world. Nothing had ever disturbed the balance of his life. But one day, that peace was shattered. It started with small annoyances. The neighbor, a woman who lived a few houses down, had always been a bit difficult. She complained about noise, parking, and even about the way his flowers bloomed. He tried to stay calm and polite, thinking it was better to avoid conflict, but over time, her complaints became more aggressive, more personal. He tried reasoning with her, but nothing worked. Then, one day, she went too far. It happened on a quiet afternoon. He was working in his backyard, trimming the hedges and planting new flowers. The sun was warm, the birds were singing, and everything seemed perfect. Suddenly, he heard shouting. At first, he thought it was just another argument, but then he saw her storming toward him. She was angry, red in the face, and moving fast. Before he could say anything, she grabbed one of the garden chairs and threw it across the yard. It smashed against the fence, sending splinters flying. He froze, unsure of what to do. This was beyond words. She wasn't just upset. She was destroying what he loved. He stepped back, hoping she would stop, but she didn't. She started pulling at the plants, stomping on flowers he had planted just days ago. The sound of snapping stems and falling soil filled the air. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Everything he had nurtured, everything he had worked for, was being destroyed in front of his eyes. His heart raced, but he stayed silent, trying to think of a way to handle this without making things worse. Neighbors began to peek out from their windows. Some whispered to each other, unsure of what to do. Others seemed to enjoy the chaos, watching the confrontation as if it were a show. He felt a mix of shame and anger. How could someone act like this? How could someone not respect another person's property? He wanted to shout, to demand that she stop, but he knew that reacting in anger would only escalate the situation. Instead, he took a deep breath and called out calmly, asking her to stop. At first she ignored him, continuing to rip out plants and kick over pots. But then, she threw a small stone toward him. It wasn't large, but it was enough to make him flinch. That was the moment he realized this was serious. This wasn't just a quarrel. This was intentional destruction. She wanted to hurt him, to ruin what he had built. He felt a surge of fear, but also a growing determination. He couldn't let this go unchecked. He stepped inside to call the authorities. As he waited, he watched through the window, seeing her move to the front yard, pulling down decorations, and even knocking over the mailbox. The thought of all the hard work he had put into making the house look nice, gone in minutes, was unbearable. He felt his stomach tighten with anxiety, but at the same time, a spark of resolve began to grow. He knew that this would not end here. Something had to be done. When the police arrived, she tried to act innocent, claiming that she had not done anything wrong. But he had photographs and videos from his security cameras showing her actions clearly. The authorities took the evidence, but he knew that it would take time for any legal action to happen. For now, he could only stand back and assess the damage. The yard was a mess. Flowers were destroyed, pots were broken, and the fence was splintered. It was heartbreaking. He spent the rest of the day cleaning up as best as he could. It wasn't easy. He felt exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. But as he worked, he thought about what had happened. This wasn't just about the plants or the chair. It was about respect, boundaries, and justice. He realized that if he'd let this slide, it would only encourage such behavior in the future. He couldn't allow someone to destroy what he loved without consequences. That night, he sat on his porch, staring at the remnants of the day's chaos. He thought about all the years he had spent building his life, the effort he had put into creating a home, and the feeling of security he had once taken for granted. Now, everything felt fragile. But along with the sadness, a sense of clarity came. He understood that he had to act, but he also knew he needed a plan. Anger alone would not help him. He had to be smart, patient, and precise. As the night grew darker, he made a promise to himself. He would not allow this injustice to define his life. He would find a way to respond that was fair, legal, and unforgettable. He would take back control, restore what was lost, and make sure that everyone understood that actions have consequences. The events of that day had sparked something in him, something stronger than anger. It was the resolve to protect his home, his dignity, and his peace. He slept fitfully, dreams filled with the chaos of the day and visions of what he would do next. In the morning, he woke with a renewed sense of purpose. He began documenting everything in detail: photographs, videos, witness accounts. Every broken pot, every trampled flower, every act of destruction was recorded meticulously. He knew that this would be important later. He wasn't just cleaning up. He was preparing for a response that would make a statement, a response that would show that patience, courage, and planning could triumph over recklessness and aggression. The days that followed were tense. He tried to maintain a calm demeanor around the neighborhood, but inside he was strategizing. Every interaction, every conversation was measured. He didn't want to give the neighbor any reason to escalate further. But at the same time, he was quietly building his case. He spoke to legal advisors, researched property laws, and prepared himself for the confrontation that was inevitable. He understood that victory would not come from a moment of anger, but from careful planning and intelligent action through it all. He kept returning to the image of his home, the place he loved, the place that had been violated. That image fueled him. It reminded him of why he was doing this, why he needed to act, and why he couldn't afford to be careless. He realized that this was more than property damage. It was about respect, boundaries, and justice. And he was determined to reclaim all of it, not through revenge and anger, but through the power of truth and preparation. By the end of the week, he had a detailed plan. He knew what steps to take, how to protect his home, and how to make sure that the person responsible could not escape accountability. He had turned his initial shock and despair into focus and determination. And though he still felt the sting of betrayal, he also felt the excitement of knowing that he was no longer powerless. The first part of his journey, the day everything changed, was over. But the next steps, the steps toward restoring justice and reclaiming his life, were just beginning. After the first shock of seeing his property destroyed, he spent the next few days trying to pick up the pieces, both literally and mentally. Cleaning up the yard was harder than he expected. The flowers he had planted with care were flattened, broken stems littered the soil, and many of his carefully arranged pots were smashed beyond repair. He worked long hours in the sun, digging, replanting, and trying to restore some sense of normalcy. But the feeling of violation lingered, a heavy weight pressing on him every time he looked at the yard. He couldn't ignore what had happened. It wasn't just about the physical damage, it was about the message it sent. Someone had crossed a line, and no one seemed to care. He tried to reach out to the neighbor in a calm and measured way. He walked over to her house one morning, hoping to speak and perhaps resolve the conflict peacefully. When she opened the door, she smiled as if nothing had happened. He explained politely how her actions had damaged his property and caused him stress. He asked if she would consider compensation, or at least an apology. She laughed lightly, dismissed his concerns, and made excuses. Her words made it clear that she didn't take responsibility. That dismissal hit him harder than the physical damage. He realized he couldn't rely on kindness or diplomacy to solve this problem. Returning home, he sat on his porch, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He wondered why some people acted with such disregard for others. The world could be unfair, he thought, and sometimes justice required more than hope, it required action. He decided he would not let this moment define him, nor would he allow it to happen again. But he also knew that any action had to be careful, precise, and legal. He could not afford to make a mistake that might come back to haunt him. The following days were quiet but tense. He noticed the subtle ways the neighbor tried to provoke him, leaving trash near his driveway, making loud noises, even attempting to intimidate him when he was outside. Every small act felt like a test of patience. At first, it made him angry. He wanted to yell, confront her, and demand that she stop. But then, he remembered his plan. Reacting in anger would give her power, and he didn't want that. He had to be smarter. He needed to observe, document, and prepare. He began documenting everything. Every time she crossed a line, he wrote it down in a notebook, noting the date, time, and what had happened. He took photos and videos when possible. He talked to neighbors discreetly, asking if they had noticed her behavior. Slowly, he started to see a pattern. Her actions weren't random. They were intentional. She seemed to enjoy creating discomfort for him, testing boundaries and seeing if he would react. Understanding this changed his perspective. He was no longer just a victim. He was gathering the evidence he needed to take control. At work, he poured himself into his tasks, using focus as a way to cope with the tension at home. He thought about his yard and house constantly, planning how he could protect them in the future. But he also used his free time to research property rights, local regulations, and legal steps he could take. He knew that knowledge was power. The more he learned, the more confident he became. He wasn't just reacting. He was preparing to act in a way that would make a lasting impact. Despite the preparation, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, he would lie in bed thinking about what had happened. He replayed the day of destruction in his mind, imagining different ways he could have reacted. Sometimes the thoughts were dark, and he felt the temptation of immediate revenge. But he reminded himself why he couldn't take that path. Impulsive actions could ruin his reputation, escalate the conflict, or even get him in trouble. He had to remain calm, focused, and patient. True revenge, he realized, wasn't about anger, it was about strategy and timing. He also reached out to a few close friends for advice, though carefully, not wanting to escalate gossip in the neighborhood. They were supportive, reminding him that his feelings were valid and that he had every right to protect his property. Some suggested legal steps, while others advised gathering evidence and letting the law take its course. Their encouragement strengthened his resolve. He realized that even in moments of isolation, he was not alone. Support, guidance, and careful planning could turn the situation around. Meanwhile, the neighbor continued her provocations. She would make sudden appearances near his property, sometimes shouting or leaving debris where it would be most noticeable. Each act tested his patience, but he kept his composure. He made a conscious effort to respond only when necessary and to document everything. This self-control became a quiet source of pride. He realized that while she might try to intimidate him, he had control over his actions and reactions, and that control gave him power. One afternoon, as he was repairing a broken fence, he noticed her approaching again. Normally, this would have made him anxious, but he stayed calm. She began complaining loudly about something trivial, hoping to provoke him. He simply nodded, acknowledged her words politely, and returned to his work. That moment felt like a turning point. He recognized that, while she tried to create chaos, he had the ability to remain steady. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. As the weeks passed, he focused on restoring his yard and home as much as possible. He replaced broken pots, replanted flowers, and mended the fence. Each repaired item felt like reclaiming a part of his life that had been damaged. At the same time, he continued to gather evidence and seek advice, building a case that could not be ignored. The combination of action, preparation, and patience gave him a sense of control and hope. He understood that the emotional damage caused by the neighbor would not disappear overnight, but he was slowly taking steps to regain peace. Through it all, he reflected on the lessons he was learning. He realized that anger and immediate retaliation often made situations worse. True strength, he discovered, came from calmness, planning, and knowledge. By documenting the destruction and maintaining composure, he was preparing not just to respond, but to respond in a way that would be undeniable. This realization became his guide. He no longer felt like a victim. He felt like someone with purpose and direction. He also began thinking about the future, imagining how he would prevent similar problems. He considered security measures, better fencing, and strategies to avoid confrontation while still standing his ground. Each plan reinforced his confidence. He was no longer reacting blindly. He was acting deliberately, with thought and precision. The emotional satisfaction of preparation replaced the initial fear and frustration. It was empowering as time went on. He noticed that some neighbors who had been indifferent or even amused by the situation began to take notice. People saw him working tirelessly, documenting carefully, and maintaining calm in the face of provocations. Their perception shifted. He realized that his measured response not only protected him legally, but also earned quiet respect in the community. The power of patience and preparation became clear. True impact, he thought, was often quiet, deliberate, undeniable. By the end of the month, he had rebuilt most of what had been destroyed. More importantly, he had rebuilt his confidence and sense of control. The neighbors' provocations had continued, but they no longer intimidated him. He had learned that staying calm, documenting evidence, seeking advice, and planning carefully were far more effective than reacting impulsively. His life was slowly returning to normal, and he felt stronger and more capable than ever. He knew that the situation was not fully resolved. The neighbor had caused harm, and accountability had to be established. But he was ready. He had gathered evidence, built a strategy, and strengthened his resolve. The foundation for the next steps that would restore justice and bring closure was firmly in place. The experience had been painful and challenging, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about resilience, patience, and the power of thoughtful action. The journey was far from over, but he was no longer afraid, no longer powerless, and no longer unsure of what needed to be done. As time went on, he began to notice patterns in her behavior that he had not fully seen before. She was unpredictable but not careless. Every act of destruction, every provocation, seemed carefully timed. It became clear that this wasn't just a moment of anger or frustration, it was a plan, an ongoing effort to unsettle him. Recognizing this changed his perspective. He knew he had to go beyond just repairing the damage. He had to anticipate her moves, outthink her, and prepare a response that would be undeniable. He started spending more time observing from a distance. Early mornings, he would take a cup of coffee to the porch and watch, noting when she came out, how she behaved, and what patterns existed. He kept detailed notes. Each observation added pieces to a puzzle. He began to understand her routines, what triggered her, and how she reacted to different situations. He realized that knowledge was a powerful weapon. The more he understood, the less control she had over him. At the same time, he continued documenting the evidence of previous incidents. Photos of broken fences, trampled flowers, and overturned furniture were carefully cataloged. Videos of her actions, combined with notes about witnesses and dates, built a clear and undeniable record. This was no longer just about emotional satisfaction. It was about building a case that could not be ignored. The meticulous records gave him confidence. He knew that, when the time came, he would have the facts to back up his actions. He also began to reach out to legal advisors quietly, asking questions about property rights, damages, and the most effective ways to hold someone accountable. The advisors were clear. Evidence and patience were crucial. Acting impulsively could backfire, but a measured and documented approach would have a much greater impact. He took this advice seriously. He was no longer reacting to her actions emotionally. He was responding strategically. Life around the neighborhood started to shift subtly. Some neighbors who had been passive or dismissive now looked at him with quiet respect. They noticed his composure, his careful work in repairing the property, and the fact that he wasn't letting anger control him. He realized that his actions, while personal, were also shaping perceptions. This gave him a sense of satisfaction. He was taking control not only of his own life, but of the narrative around the situation. Meanwhile, the neighbor did not stop. Her provocations continued, though now they seemed more calculated, perhaps even desperate. She would leave trash strategically, knock on the door loudly, or attempt small acts of damage. Each time, he resisted the urge to react impulsively. He observed, documented, and stayed calm. These moments were tests of patience, and he met each one with discipline. Over time, he felt a quiet sense of power growing within him. He was no longer at the mercy of her actions. He was in control of how he responded. One day, he noticed something unusual. She had started leaving notes on his gate and mailbox, thinly veiled insults disguised as complaints. The notes were meant to provoke and unsettle him, but instead, they provided more evidence of her intent. He carefully photographed each note, stored them in a folder, and added them to his growing record. What was meant to intimidate him only strengthened his position. He realized that every action she took was another opportunity to build a case and assert his control. He also took steps to improve security and protection around his property. Cameras were installed in strategic locations, fences were reinforced, and sensitive areas were secured. While these measures were practical, they also gave him peace of mind. He no longer felt vulnerable or exposed. By taking proactive steps, he created a sense of stability and preparation. He was no longer a passive victim, but an active protector of his home and life. The more he prepared, the more he began to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just a personal dispute. It was a lesson in resilience, strategy, and patience. Every day of calm observation, careful documentation, and deliberate action strengthened his ability to respond effectively. He understood that the ultimate outcome would depend not on rash reactions, but on careful planning and timing. He started imagining different scenarios, anticipating potential outcomes, and planning responses. He considered how to present evidence, how to approach authorities, and how to ensure that the truth could not be disputed. Each scenario was analyzed in detail. He was preparing not just for immediate action, but for a decisive resolution that would leave no room for doubt. This mental preparation became a source of confidence and empowerment. Throughout this period, he also focused on maintaining his emotional balance. He knew that anger and frustration could cloud judgment, so he found ways to manage stress. He exercised regularly, took walks, and spent time on hobbies that brought him calm. By maintaining mental and emotional clarity, he ensured that when the moment of confrontation arrived, he would be focused and effective. He realized that self-control was as important as evidence and strategy. The days passed with a mixture of quiet observation and careful preparation. He had become highly aware of the dynamics around his property, understanding the neighbor's behavior and readying himself for the next step. His life, though disrupted, had found a rhythm, one of vigilance, patience, and quiet determination. He no longer felt powerless. He felt capable and prepared. Neighbors began to notice the change in his demeanor. He moved through the community with calm confidence, and his focus on rebuilding and protecting his home was clear. Even those who had doubted him began to see that he was not someone to underestimate. The respect he earned was not loud or dramatic, but it was unmistakable. His careful actions and measured responses spoke louder than words ever could. One morning, while reviewing his notes and photos, he realized that the evidence he had gathered painted a very clear picture. Each act of provocation, each moment of destruction, was documented and verifiable. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that he had not only survived the chaos, but had turned it into an advantage. He had turned the tables in his mind, and soon he would turn them in reality. He also began to consider the psychological impact. The neighbor had tried to unsettle him, to provoke fear and anger, but instead he had responded with calm and strategy. Every act she had hoped would intimidate him had only strengthened his position. He understood now that real power came from control, patience, and preparation. She had underestimated him, and that miscalculation would prove critical. He spent nights planning the next steps carefully. Every detail was considered, the timing of evidence presentation, the witnesses who could support his claims, and the best way to ensure accountability. He knew that the confrontation would need to be undeniable, leaving no room for excuses or denial. The preparation itself became a form of quiet revenge, a way to ensure that when the time came, the outcome would be decisive and lasting. Despite the long days and constant vigilance, he found moments of peace. He worked on small projects around his home, repaired broken areas, and slowly restored the yard to a place of beauty. Each repaired section was a reminder that while destruction could shake him temporarily, it could not define his life. He was reclaiming control, both physically and emotionally. By the end of this period, he had transformed his approach from reactive to proactive. He had moved beyond the initial shock, beyond frustration, and into a state of calculated readiness. Every action, every decision, and every observation was part of a larger plan. He was no longer simply trying to survive the neighbor's provocations. He was preparing to resolve them decisively. He realized that the turning point was near. The evidence was ready, the strategy was in place, and he had built the patience and clarity needed to act effectively. The days of being reactive, fearful, and stressed were behind him. He had learned that power came not from aggression, but from knowledge, preparation, and self-control. He was ready to take the next step, the step that would change the balance and ensure that justice was served. The moment of truth, he knew, was approaching. And he would be ready. The day of confrontation arrived, though he had known for weeks that it would come. Everything he had done up to this point had been preparation, patience, and observation, and now it was time to put that preparation to use. The moment felt heavy with anticipation. He woke early, reviewing all the evidence one last time, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. Photographs, videos, witness statements, and notes all carefully organized sat before him. This was the culmination of weeks of careful planning. He felt a mixture of nerves and determination. He knew the neighbor would not change her behavior voluntarily. Her provocations had continued despite all efforts to remain calm and diplomatic. That reality gave him clarity. This confrontation would be public, undeniable, and based entirely on truth. He dressed neatly, wanting to appear calm, confident, and collected. The impression he made mattered as much as the evidence he would present. His goal was not just to restore what was lost, but to ensure that everyone saw the reality of her actions. When he arrived at the community meeting, the room was already buzzing. People whispered, curious about the tensions between him and the neighbor. Some were skeptical, others supportive, and a few openly amused. He felt the familiar twinge of anxiety, but focused on his objective. He reminded himself that his preparation was thorough and that he had documented everything meticulously. Nothing could be denied if he presented it clearly. The meeting began with small talk and updates. But he knew that the moment for action would come quickly. When the neighbor was invited to speak, she began her usual attempts to manipulate the room, claiming innocence, exaggerating trivial issues, and trying to shift the blame. He listened calmly, taking mental notes of every word. This was the moment to act, and he had to be precise. When his turn came, he stood and spoke clearly and confidently. He laid out the timeline of events, starting from the first act of destruction to the most recent provocation. Each incident was supported by photographs, videos, and witness accounts. He presented the evidence systematically, leaving no room for doubt. The room grew quiet as people saw the documentation. The clarity of the truth was undeniable. The neighbor's attempts to interrupt or argue were ineffective. He had anticipated objections and countered them calmly, relying entirely on the facts. Her denials and excuses fell flat as the evidence spoke louder than any words she could offer. Witnesses he had spoken to quietly before the meeting confirmed his account when asked. The truth had a weight that no argument could overcome, and the room felt the shift in balance. As the evidence unfolded, the reactions of others were remarkable. Some people who had doubted him nodded in acknowledgement. Others seemed shocked, realizing that the neighbor's behavior had been ongoing and deliberate. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to seriousness. The balance of power in the room and in the neighborhood had changed. For the first time, the neighbor looked unsure, hesitant, and exposed. She could no longer control the narrative. He continued presenting, moving through each incident with calm authority. Every broken fence, trampled flower, and act of intimidation was accounted for. Every photograph, video, and witness statement was undeniable. The clarity of the facts left no room for manipulation or denial. His patience, planning, and careful documentation had built an unshakable case. The satisfaction of knowing that he had prepared perfectly gave him a quiet strength. The neighbor tried one last tactic, attempting to argue her innocence and accuse him of exaggeration. But the room no longer supported her. The evidence was too clear, the witnesses too certain, and the presentation too thorough. His calm, methodical approach contrasted sharply with her defensive, flustered behavior. In that moment, the shift was complete. The room saw not just the actions, but the character of each person involved. The difference in credibility and preparation was stark. He concluded his presentation by summarizing the impact of her actions, emotional stress, property damage, and disruption to his life. He emphasized that this was not about revenge or malice, but about accountability, boundaries, and justice. The audience responded with nods, murmurs of agreement, and quiet recognition. The power that she had wielded through chaos was now neutralized. The control had returned to him. After the meeting, he stayed for a few minutes, listening to conversations around him. People were discussing the evidence, acknowledging the fairness of his approach, and recognizing the thoroughness of his preparation. The neighbor remained silent, unable to reclaim the narrative. He realized that his strategy had not only restored his property, but it also restored his reputation and dignity. The impact of a calm, calculated, and truth-based response was clear. Returning home, he felt a sense of relief and accomplishment. The confrontation had been successful, and the evidence he had worked so hard to gather had achieved its purpose. His property was safe, and the neighbor's attempts to manipulate and intimidate were exposed. The neighborhood's perception had shifted. People now saw him as someone who acted with intelligence, patience, and integrity, rather than with anger or emotion. In the days that followed, the neighbor became noticeably quieter. Her provocations ceased, and she seemed aware that her previous actions were now fully visible and accountable. The fear, anger, and uncertainty that had once dominated the interactions were replaced by a sense of resolution. He continued to document minor incidents, not out of fear, but to ensure continued clarity and protection. He understood that vigilance was important. The immediate conflict had been decisively resolved. He also took time to reflect on the experience. He realized that this confrontation had taught him more than just the importance of preparation and evidence. It had shown him the power of patience, self-control, and strategic thinking. Reacting impulsively might have provided temporary satisfaction, but it would not have produced the lasting results he had achieved. The difference between reaction and strategy had never been clearer. Repairing and restoring his property continued. But now, with renewed confidence and purpose, each improvement he made was a symbol of resilience and recovery. Every new flower planted, every fence repaired, was a tangible reminder of what had been accomplished through patience and careful planning. He felt a sense of pride not just in his property, but in the way he had handled the situation. He also began to share his story quietly with trusted friends and family, emphasizing the lessons learned. The importance of documenting evidence, maintaining composure, and planning carefully resonated with those who heard it. He realized that the experience, though painful, had provided valuable life lessons that extended beyond this single conflict. He had grown stronger, wiser, more confident in his ability to face challenges. The neighborhood, now aware of the truth, began to treat him with respect. People who had once doubted him acknowledged his composure and preparation. The perception of power had shifted clearly and permanently. The neighbor, now unable to manipulate the narrative, faced social accountability as well as legal clarity. The balance had changed, and the outcome was undeniable. Through this process, he understood that revenge does not always come from anger or rash action. True impact comes from preparation, clarity, and calm authority. The results were lasting and undeniable, achieved without losing control or resorting to violence. The sense of satisfaction he felt was deeper than any fleeting moment of anger could provide. Justice, when executed thoughtfully and strategically, was far more powerful. The day closed with a quiet sense of resolution. He walked through his yard, noting the repaired areas and the small victories in every corner. The damage from the neighbor's actions was repaired, and the lessons from the confrontation had strengthened him in ways he could not have anticipated. His home was safe, his dignity restored, and his understanding of strategy, patience, and truth had grown profoundly. The confrontation had been the turning point, the moment when preparation met opportunity, and the results spoke for themselves as he sat on the porch that evening. Reflecting on the events, he realized that the experience had changed him. He was no longer simply a homeowner reacting to chaos. He was someone who could assess, prepare, and execute with clarity and confidence. The conflict had been challenging, but it had also revealed his capacity for resilience and intelligence. He knew that whatever challenges came next, he would face them with the same calm, strategic approach. Guided by evidence and reason, the neighborhood now recognized the truth, and the balance of power had shifted definitively. The neighbors' actions were no longer hidden, no longer excused, and no longer effective. The careful preparation, patient observation, and strategic execution had achieved a clear and lasting victory. The confrontation had been resolved, justice had been restored, and the sense of control, dignity, and security returned fully to him. After the confrontation, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The neighbor, now fully aware that her actions had consequences and were no longer able to manipulate or intimidate, she became noticeably quieter. She no longer made provocations or attempted to disrupt his life. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of relief and calm that he had not experienced since the initial incident. The tension that had once defined every interaction in the neighborhood had finally eased, replaced by clarity and a sense of restored order. He spent the next few days reflecting on everything that had happened. The chaos, destruction, and emotional stress had taken a toll on him. But the experience had also revealed his capacity for resilience, patience, and strategic thinking. He realized that the way he had handled the situation calmly, methodically, and with evidence had not only restored his property, but it also earned him respect and credibility. The lessons he had learned were valuable and would shape the way he approached challenges in the future. As he repaired and restored his property, he found satisfaction in each small victory. Every flower replanted, every fence repaired, and every broken item replaced felt like a step toward reclaiming what had been lost. The process was therapeutic. It reminded him that while destruction can hurt, the act of rebuilding brings strength and resilience. He took pride in knowing that he had not allowed the chaos to define him or his home. Neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation began to treat him with a quiet respect. Some offered help with minor repairs, while others simply acknowledged him with a nod or smile. The community's perception had shifted. They recognized that he had handled a difficult situation with intelligence and composure. The narrative had changed from one of chaos and victimhood to one of strategy, patience, and justice. He realized that reputation and character often speak louder than any words, and he felt a sense of quiet accomplishment. With the immediate conflict resolved, he also focused on preventing future problems. He upgraded security measures, reinforced fences, and installed cameras to monitor sensitive areas. These steps were not only practical, but also symbolized a return to control. He no longer felt vulnerable or exposed. Each precaution was a reminder that while he could not control everyone's actions, he could control his response and protect his life and property. This sense of security was invaluable. The neighbor's silence spoke volumes. She no longer challenged him, and even when she appeared in public spaces, her behavior was restrained. It was clear that the evidence he had presented and the calm authority he had maintained during the confrontation had shifted the power dynamic permanently. She could no longer create fear or doubt, and he could move forward without concern. The balance had been restored, and with it, a sense of peace returned to his life. In the weeks that followed, he also began to share his experience with trusted friends and family. He explained the importance of documenting incidents, maintaining composure, and preparing carefully before taking action. The story became a lesson in resilience and strategy. He emphasized that true impact comes from thoughtful preparation rather than impulsive reactions. His friends listened intently, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. It was a story of empowerment, not just personal victory. He also reflected on the emotional journey he had experienced. The initial shock and anger had been intense, but over time he had learned to channel those emotions into productive action. Patience, observation, and careful planning had transformed feelings of helplessness into a sense of control. The experience had taught him that emotional intelligence, combined with strategic thinking, is a powerful tool for navigating conflicts. He felt stronger and more capable than he had before. As the neighborhood returned to a sense of normalcy, he continued to focus on his life and home. He took pride in the little things: tending the garden, organizing the yard, and ensuring that his home remained a place of peace. Each act of care reinforced the sense of ownership and control that had been challenged. It was a reminder that while others might attempt to disrupt, consistent effort and attention could restore order and beauty. The neighbor, now aware that her actions had been fully exposed, faced not only social accountability, but also the legal clarity that came from the evidence he had meticulously collected. While he had never sought vengeance and anger, the outcome ensured that she could not escape responsibility. The combination of careful documentation, calm presentation, and strategic execution had achieved justice. It was a victory rooted in intelligence, patience, and preparation. He also realized the importance of maintaining calm and clarity in all aspects of life. The experience had reinforced that reacting impulsively often escalates conflicts. While strategic action yields lasting results, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that he could face challenges with a clear mind, careful planning, and steady composure. This lesson, learned through difficult circumstances, would guide him in future conflicts, both large and small. Over time, the neighborhood's atmosphere changed. The incident became a quiet reminder that actions have consequences, and that respect, preparation, and integrity are powerful. People who had once doubted him now recognized his composure and intelligence. The story of the confrontation spread subtly, not as gossip, but as a lesson in handling adversity with strategy and patience. He felt satisfaction in knowing that his approach had not only resolved the conflict, but also set an example of thoughtful action. He also reflected on the personal growth he had experienced. The situation had tested his patience, emotional control, and ability to strategize under pressure. It had challenged him in ways he had never imagined. But through careful observation, meticulous documentation, and calm execution, he had turned a moment of chaos into a demonstration of resilience and intelligence. He felt proud, not just for the outcome, but for the way he had conducted himself throughout the ordeal. In the end, he understood that true power does not come from anger or aggression. It comes from preparation, knowledge, and the ability to act with calm authority. His actions had restored his home, his dignity, and his sense of security. They had also exposed the neighbor's behavior and established accountability. The outcome was lasting, undeniable, and achieved without resorting to rash decisions or violence. It was a triumph of strategy, patience, and intelligence. He continued to live his life with a renewed sense of confidence. Each day brought small victories in maintaining his home, engaging with neighbors, and enjoying the peace he had fought to protect. The experience had taught him the value of vigilance, preparation, and composure. He knew that challenges would arise in the future, but he also knew that he had the skills, patience, and wisdom to handle them effectively. The story concluded not with revenge, but with resolution. The neighbor's actions were no longer a threat. He had demonstrated that calm, strategic action can overcome chaos and aggression. His home was safe, his reputation restored, and his confidence strengthened. The experience had left a lasting impact, teaching him lessons about patience, preparation, and the power of thoughtful action. In the quiet moments, he reflected on the journey. From the initial shock and destruction to the careful preparation, confrontation, and resolution, he had grown in understanding and strength. The experience had shown him that true control comes from patience, strategy, and integrity. He had faced chaos and emerged not only victorious, but wiser and more capable than before. The lessons learned would remain with him, guiding him in all future challenges. The sense of peace, respect, and justice would endure.